Have you ever wondered why, the more you mature, the less desire you feel to be surrounded by people? What if what everyone calls isolation isn't a psychological problem, but the beginning of the most important transformation of your life? Maybe you've already felt strange for preferring silence over empty conversations, for choosing to be alone instead of attending gatherings that once felt enjoyable, or for noticing that certain environments have simply stopped making sense. And inevitably, the question that so many people carry in secret arises: is something wrong with me? Society teaches us from an early age that being alone is a sign of failure, sadness, or social difficulty. We are constantly encouraged to believe that happiness means being surrounded by people all the time. But what if that idea is completely wrong? What if your need to step away from the noise of the world isn't an escape, but a calling? It was precisely this kind of experience that Carl Jung devoted much of his life to understanding. While many saw loneliness as merely a symptom, Jung realized that in certain stages of life it can represent something far deeper, the beginning of a process of individuation, the psychological journey in which a person stops living solely to meet others' expectations and begins, for the first time, to discover who they truly are. This is not a comfortable change. On the contrary, it is often silent, confusing, and at times even frightening. Because when the mind begins to awaken, what once felt sufficient no longer fills the same space within you. Perhaps you've noticed that shallow conversations have started to feel exhausting, that the constant need for approval has weakened, that places once familiar now feel strangely empty, and at the same time, an unexplainable desire grows within you to remain in silence, reflecting on life, on your choices, and even on who you truly are behind all the masks you've learned to wear. What's most curious is that from the outside, this may look like simply withdrawing from people. But from the perspective of Jung's analytical psychology, the opposite may be happening. Perhaps you are not moving away from life. Perhaps you are moving closer to yourself. There is a huge difference between feeling alone and consciously choosing your own company. One comes from lack, the other comes from transformation. And very few people are able to recognize this difference because we live in a culture that values constant noise, external validation, and the permanent need to belong. Being alone without distractions means confronting thoughts, emotions, and parts of your own personality that many people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. It is no coincidence that so many people fear silence. In silence, there is no one to distract us from ourselves, but there is something even more intriguing. Jung believed there is a specific moment when loneliness stops being just a preference and begins to reveal that a profound psychological shift has already started. And most people completely misinterpret the signs of this process, believing they are losing something, when in reality they may finally be starting to find what they have been searching for their entire lives. And perhaps that is exactly why this kind of content should not go unnoticed. Because when you begin to recognize these signs within yourself, it is easy to believe you are alone in it, that no one else thinks or feels this way. But the truth is that many people are going through the same silent process of inner change, trying to understand what is happening when the external world no longer feels sufficient. If at any point in this video you recognized yourself in these words even subtly, that already says much more about you than it seems. Because recognizing this kind of reflection is not common for everyone. It requires attention, sensitivity, and above all, a willingness to look inward. So before we continue, leave a like on this video. This is not just a simple interaction. It's a way of strengthening this kind of content and allowing more people who are going through the same process to find this message at the right moment. And I want to ask you a direct question that goes beyond theory. Have you ever felt this desire to withdraw from the world without being able to explain exactly why? Have you noticed this silent shift within you, where the noise of people starts to lose meaning and silence begins to feel more real. Write it in the comments. It's not just a comment, it's part of a reflective process. Often by putting it into words, you realize you are not as isolated in this as you thought. And if this kind of content resonates with you, if these reflections on psychology, self-knowledge, and Carl Jung's perspective awaken something within you, then subscribe to the channel now. Because what comes next is not just an explanation, it is a deeper exploration that may change the way you interpret not only loneliness, but yourself. Have you ever noticed how there is a moment in life when everything starts to feel silently quieter within? Not in the external sense, but internally. As if, even surrounded by people, conversations and stimuli, something inside you begins to lose interest in the noise of the world. And almost imperceptibly you start choosing silence. Not out of rejection of others, but because certain things simply stop making sense. And it is precisely at this point that many people begin to worry. They think they are withdrawing, becoming colder, more distant, or even emotionally broken. But what if this is not a loss, but an internal reorganization? Carl Jung observed something profoundly important in human psychology. There is a period in life when personality begins to split between what we were taught to be and what we truly are. He called this the process of individuation. And this process does not happen loudly. It does not arrive as a sudden revelation. It arrives as a subtle, almost invisible discomfort that begins precisely in the way you relate to loneliness. Perhaps you've started noticing this in small things. Conversations that once felt normal now seem overly superficial. People who once fit naturally into your life start to feel distant from your inner reality. And without realizing it, you begin to prefer moments alone. Not because you are escaping, but because something within you is trying to emerge without external interference. And here is the point most people fail to understand. When Jung spoke about loneliness, he was not referring to ordinary social isolation, but to a psychological state in which the psyche begins to detach from external identifications. It is as if the mind quietly begins to say, this is no longer enough for who you are becoming. And this can create confusion. Because, at the same time there is a sense of peace in silence, there is also a strange discomfort. A kind of emptiness that is not exactly pain, but also not comfort. It is something in between, as if you were standing between two versions of yourself, the old version, which sought acceptance, validation, and belonging, and a new version, still undefined, which begins to value introspection, awareness, and emotional depth. And this transition is rarely understood by those around you. Most of the time it is interpreted as withdrawal, personality change, or disinterest in the world. But according to Jungian analytical psychology, this withdrawal may be precisely the beginning of the most important encounter in a person's life, the encounter with one's own psyche without masks. And this does not happen amid the constant noise of external expectations. It happens in silence, in introspection, in what many people avoid out of fear of confronting parts of themselves they have never truly observed. In this state, loneliness begins to take on a new meaning. It stops being merely the absence of company and becomes a psychological space of inner observation. And as you begin to go through this process of individuation, something curious happens without you immediately noticing. The way the world responds to you also begins to change. Not because the world itself has changed, but because you are no longer operating within it in the same way. And this creates a kind of silent tension that is difficult to explain to anyone who has never experienced it. You start to notice that certain social dynamics no longer hold you in the same way they used to. The need to please diminishes. The search for external approval loses intensity. And without even realizing it, you begin to occupy a more observant role than a participatory one in many situations. It's not that you become indifferent, but rather that you begin to see more clearly the patterns behind human interaction. The social game, the masks, the repeated roles, all of it starts to become more visible, and this has a profound effect on relationships. Because when you change internally, even without saying a word, your presence changes. And the people around you begin to feel it, even if they cannot explain why. Some move closer as if sensing a kind of authenticity emerging. Others move away, as if something within them is destabilized by your new way of being in the world. Carl Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And this point becomes very real at this stage. Because as you begin to integrate parts of yourself that were once hidden, your way of acting, thinking, and reacting is no longer purely automatic. You begin to notice choices that once felt inevitable, but now reveal themselves as repeated patterns. And this is exactly why people who go through this process begin to appear different in the eyes of others. Not because they have suddenly changed personality, but because they have begun to reduce the distance between what they feel internally and what they express externally. This creates a kind of new coherence that is not always comfortable for those who are used to more adaptable and predictable versions of the same person. At this point, loneliness gains an even deeper layer of meaning. It stops being just a space for introspection and becomes a kind of mirror. Because when there is less external interference, you begin to perceive more clearly how your emotions actually function. You observe your reactions without the immediate filter of social validation. You start identifying emotional patterns that previously went unnoticed, because they were constantly diluted in the ongoing movement of the world, and this completely changes your relationship with your own identity. Because, little by little, you begin to realize that what you called me may have been to a large extent an adaptive construction, a set of learned responses designed to belong, avoid rejection, maintain bonds, and fit into certain contexts. And when this becomes visible, a strange feeling of internal displacement arises, as if you were standing between two versions of yourself at the same time. One version still tied to old forms of validation, and another that begins to value silence, depth, and internal observation. And this space between the two is not empty in the usual sense. It is filled with perception. It is where insights, reflections, and an increasing awareness of how you function emotionally begin to emerge. And what is most interesting is that, at this stage, loneliness stops being something you simply prefer or avoid. It becomes a natural state of internal reorganization, not because you reject people, but because your attention begins to turn inward more frequently. And this even changes the way you choose who to relate to, how much time you dedicate to the external world, and the type of energy you allow into your life. And the deeper this perception becomes, the more evident it becomes that there is an important difference between being alone and being guided inward by a psychological process you do not fully control. Because at this point, loneliness is no longer just a behavioral choice. It begins to function as a mechanism of internal adjustment, where old forms of identity begin to lose strength while something new is still under construction. And this raises an even more unsettling question, because if this process is truly happening within you, then what seemed like a simple change in habits or personal preference may actually be a much deeper movement of the psyche. Something that is not only reorganizing your relationship with the world, but also silently redefining who you are becoming as all of this unfolds. And perhaps the deepest point of this entire process is precisely what almost no one notices when they begin to experience this silent transformation. There comes a moment when loneliness stops being merely a psychological state and becomes something much more stable within you, not as the absence of people, but as a different form of presence with yourself. Because as this process of individuation deepens, something changes in the way you relate to your own silence. At first it may feel strange, even uncomfortable, but over time, it begins to reveal a kind of internal organization that was previously covered by the constant noise of the external world. And you realize that it is no longer just about being alone, but about being in contact with something within you that was once constantly interrupted. Carl Jung described this kind of change as a shift from external dependency toward a more direct relationship with one's own psyche. In other words, what was once sought outside, validation, belonging, approval, begins to be gradually reorganized within. And this does not happen in an idealized or romantic way. It is a slow process, full of ambiguity, where moments of clarity mix with periods of confusion and deep introspection. And this is where loneliness takes on a completely different meaning, because it stops being interpreted as absence and starts being perceived as space, a psychological space where you are no longer merely reacting to the world, but beginning to observe how you yourself construct your relationship with it. And this changes everything, because for the first time, you are not just experiencing your emotions. You are beginning to see them happening. At this stage, many people report something curious. They do not necessarily feel alone, but instead experience a kind of emotional autonomy that did not exist before. It is as if the constant need for external stimulation decreases, and in its place emerges a greater capacity to remain with oneself without immediate escape. And this is not isolation in the usual sense. It is a reorganization of psychological attention, and Jung already pointed toward this kind of experience when speaking about the self, that central core of the personality that does not depend on external structures to remain intact. As the ego ceases to occupy the absolute center of experience, other layers of the psyche begin to emerge more strongly. And this includes both more conscious aspects and unconscious contents that begin to integrate. That is why this stage can be so transformative and at the same time so challenging. Because when you begin to no longer rely on the same level of external stimulation, you also start to see more clearly everything that was previously compensated by the constant noise of everyday life. Delayed emotions, avoided thoughts, sensations that never had space to be fully understood, and this creates a very interesting paradox. The more you move away from the need for external validation, the closer you get to a kind of internal coherence. But at the same time, this process can make you appear different in the eyes of others. Not because you have become distant, but because your way of being present is no longer based on constant adaptation, but on a quieter form of authenticity, and this inevitably reorganizes your relationships. Some remain. Others stop making sense, not out of rejection, but because the internal axis from which you relate to the world is no longer the same. And this is where many people confuse this process with loss, when in reality it is closer to a natural selection of what still resonates with who you are becoming. And perhaps the most intriguing aspect of all this is that, in this state, loneliness no longer needs to be sought or avoided. It simply happens as part of the way you exist. And gradually, it stops being perceived as something external and becomes a kind of internal foundation, a point of observation from which you begin to see your own life with greater clarity. And when this stabilizes, a new perception arises that once again shifts the entire internal dynamic, because it is no longer just about understanding what is happening to you, but about perceiving how this new form of consciousness silently influences everything around you, including the way you choose, feel, and position yourself in relation to your own life. And if you have made it this far, it is very likely that this video has not been just another piece of content consumed passively. On some level, these ideas may have touched something you were already feeling, but did not quite know how to put into words. And that alone already says a lot. If this message resonated with you, even in small parts, consider subscribing to the channel. not as an automatic gesture, but as a way to continue following reflections that go beyond the surface. Exploring this kind of internal transformation that many people experience in silence. Yet few can truly explain, and I want to invite you to do something simple, but honest. Write in the comments what you felt during this video. It does not need to be elaborate. It can be a phrase, a word, or something short like, "This describes me," or "I feel this, but I've never said it." This kind of exchange helps not only the channel, but also other people who are going through the same process and think they are alone in it. If this content made you reflect, leave a like as well. It helps this kind of video reach more people who might be in exactly that moment of internal transition, trying to understand what is happening within them. And if you know someone who tends to be more introspective, who has been slowly withdrawing, who seems different or quieter than before, share this video with them. Sometimes a simple message can help someone understand themselves better than they have in years. And now, the most important part, do not stop here. In the next video, we will go even deeper into this process. Because there is a specific point in this psychological journey where loneliness changes meaning once again. And that is exactly where many people begin to realize that internal transformation goes far beyond what they originally imagined.